The forest east of Aachen smelled of wet earth and cordite. November rain had turned the ground into a slick morass that clung to boots and uniforms alike. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed his back against a shattered oak tree, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Around him, the remnants of his platoon huddled in shallow foxholes, 19 men who had been 43 just 2 days ago. The artillery had stopped an hour before dawn. That silence was worse than the shelling. "They're coming," whispered Gefreiter Hans Becker, his rifle trembling in mud-caked hands. At 19, he was the youngest among them, his face still bearing the soft features of the farm boy he'd been 6 months earlier. Klaus nodded but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. No ammunition, no food since yesterday morning, no orders from battalion headquarters because battalion headquarters no longer existed. Through the skeletal trees, he could hear engines, American half-tracks, and the distinctive rumble of Sherman tanks positioning themselves along the ridgeline. Feldwebel Otto Stern crawled over, his left arm bound in a filthy bandage. "We can't hold," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a career soldier facing the unthinkable. Not without ammunition, not without support. Klaus looked at the faces around him, exhausted, hungry, some barely conscious. Werner, the machinist from Stuttgart, had a head wound that needed proper medical attention. Young Becker's hands shook from something beyond cold. Even Stern, who had fought in Poland and France, looked hollow. "White flag?" Klaus asked. Stern's jaw tightened, but he reached into his pack and pulled out a torn undershirt. Better than dying for nothing. The decision hung in the air like the morning mist. Years of propaganda, of speeches about duty and honor, of threats about what Americans did to prisoners, all of it crashed against the simple reality that they could not fight and would not survive. Klaus tied the white cloth to a branch and stood slowly, raising it above the foxhole. His heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, Becker made a small sound, half sob, half prayer. "Weapons down," Stern ordered, hands visible. The American voices came first, shouting commands in accented German. Then figures emerged from the tree line, infantrymen in mottled uniforms, rifles raised, moving with practiced caution. They were younger than Klaus expected, their faces tense but not cruel. A sergeant approached, his carbine pointed but not aimed. "Raus! Hände hoch!" His German was clumsy but clear. One by one, the Germans climbed from their positions, hands raised, eyes adjusting to faces they'd been told were monsters. The Americans searched them efficiently, removing knives, checking for concealed weapons, examining papers. No one was struck, no one was shot. Klaus watched as a medic, a corporal with a red cross on his helmet, immediately knelt beside Werner, examining the head wound with gentle hands. The medic said something in English, then tried German. "Not bad. You be okay." Werner stared at him with incomprehension. They were lined up in a column, hands on heads, and marched west. The walk took 2 hours through devastated countryside, past burned-out vehicles, past graves marked with crude crosses, past villages reduced to rubble. American military police directed them at checkpoints, and curious GIs watched them pass, some with hostility, others with something like pity. The processing camp appeared at midday, a sprawling collection of tents surrounded by barbed wire, already holding hundreds of German prisoners. Guards directed them through a gate where they surrendered personal items, were photographed, and given identification tags. The process was mechanical but not brutal. Klaus had expected beatings, interrogations, perhaps worse. Instead, an American lieutenant with wire-rimmed glasses asked basic questions through an interpreter. Name, rank, unit, hometown. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," the interpreter said, his German perfect. "Follow the rules, you will be safe." As evening fell, they were assigned to a section of the camp, a large tent with wooden pallets for sleeping and a pot-belly stove that provided minimal warmth. The men collapsed onto the pallets, too exhausted for conversation. Outside, American guards patrolled the perimeter, their silhouettes visible against searchlights. Klaus lay on his pallet staring at the canvas ceiling. He was alive. They were all alive. But surrender meant uncertainty. About the future, about family back home, about what came next. Around him, men whispered prayers or wept quietly into their blankets. Young Becker curled into a ball, shoulders shaking. Through the tent flap, Klaus could see the guard tower and beyond it, the glow of fires where American soldiers prepared their evening meal. The smell of cooking food drifted across the wire, real food, not the sawdust bread and watery soup they'd survived on for weeks. Tomorrow would bring questions, uncertainty, perhaps transfer to another camp. But tonight, for the first time in months, the artillery was silent, and no one was trying to kill them. Klaus closed his eyes and tried not to think about home. Chapter 2. The Morning Ritual. Dawn arrived with the clang of metal on metal, guards striking posts to wake the camp. Klaus opened his eyes to weak sunlight filtering through canvas, the tent filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, and quiet German conversations. Around him, men stirred on their pallets, facing another day of captivity. "Formation in 10 minutes?" a guard shouted in broken German from outside the tent. The prisoners filed out into the cold morning air, breath misting, forming ragged lines for morning count. American guards moved along the rows, checking faces against clipboards. Klaus stood between Stern and Becker, watching as MPs conducted their routine inspection of the compound. After count, the guards directed them toward a collection point near the mess area. Klaus expected the usual, a tin cup of watery broth, perhaps a small piece of bread if they were fortunate. That was what they'd received yesterday, barely enough to quiet hungry stomachs. But something was different this morning. American soldiers were setting up tables outside a large tent, and Klaus could see steam rising from metal containers. The smell hit him before he could identify the source. Rich, bitter, unmistakable. Coffee. Real coffee. "Is that—" Becker began. "Can't be," Stern muttered, but his eyes were fixed on the setup. The guards directed them into a line. As they shuffled forward, Klaus could see American cooks pouring dark liquid from large percolators into tin cups. Not the ersatz coffee made from acorns and chicory they'd choked down for years, but actual coffee that steamed and smelled like the mornings before the war. When Klaus reached the front of the line, an American private, barely older than Becker with freckles and red hair, held out a cup. The steam curled upward and Klaus hesitated, certain there was some mistake. "Go on," the private said in English, gesturing. "Take it." Klaus accepted the cup with both hands, feeling its warmth seep into his cold fingers. Behind the serving table, a sergeant with a lined face watched the Germans' reactions with what might have been amusement. "Sugar?" the sergeant asked, holding up a bowl. Klaus stared. "Sugar. White sugar, not the brown substitute or honey if you were lucky." He nodded mutely, and the sergeant dropped 2 lumps into his cup. Behind him, Becker received his cup and immediately brought it to his nose, inhaling deeply. Tears formed in the young soldier's eyes. "My God," he whispered. They were directed to sit on logs arranged near the mess tent. Klaus lowered himself carefully, cradling the cup as if it might disappear. Around him, German prisoners sat in stunned silence, holding their coffee, unable to reconcile this small kindness with everything they'd been told about their captors. Stern took his first sip and closed his eyes. "Real coffee," he said quietly. "I haven't tasted real coffee since 1942. "Why?" Becker asked, looking at Klaus with confusion. "Why would they give us this?" Klaus had no answer. He sipped his coffee, hot, bitter, perfect, and watched American soldiers moving about the camp. Some were laughing, sharing cigarettes. Others looked tired, faces showing the same exhaustion Klaus recognized in his own men. They were just soldiers, he realized. Not the caricatures from propaganda posters. Not monsters or devils, but tired young men far from home. A corporal approached their group, accompanied by an interpreter, a German-American with a Brooklyn accent who'd introduced himself as Sergeant Fisher the day before. "How's the coffee?" Fisher asked in German. "It's good," Stern replied carefully. "Very good. We don't understand why." "Geneva Convention," Fisher interrupted. Says prisoners get the same rations as guards. We drink coffee, you drink coffee, simple as that. But, Becker started. Look, kid, Fisher said, not unkindly. You're prisoners of war, not animals. You follow the rules, we treat you right. That's how it works here. He moved on to another group, leaving the Germans to contemplate this statement. Klaus watched young American soldiers distributing bread. Real wheat bread, not the heavy black bread mixed with sawdust they'd eaten for years. With the bread came margarine and small tins of jam. Werner, his head now properly bandaged by American medics, sat nearby with his portion. I don't understand any of this, he said. 3 days ago we were enemies. They were trying to kill us. Now they're giving us coffee and jam. War's over for us, Stern observed, tearing his bread. We're out of it. Maybe that changes things. Klaus drank his coffee slowly, savoring each sip. Around the compound, similar scenes played out. German prisoners receiving hot coffee, expressing shock, confusion, and something like gratitude. Some wept. Others sat in silence, processing this small act of humanity in the midst of war's inhumanity. A young American guard stood nearby, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He couldn't have been more than 20 with a round, earnest face. He caught Klaus looking and nodded. Klaus nodded back. The coffee was getting cold, but Klaus didn't mind. He finished it, feeling its warmth spread through his chest, and for a brief moment the war seemed very far away. Chapter 3. Questions without answers. The afternoon brought interrogations. Klaus was summoned to a tent where an American intelligence officer sat behind a folding table, studying files. The officer was a captain, perhaps 35, with careful eyes and the bearing of someone who'd been a lawyer or teacher before the war. Sit, the captain said in fluent German, gesturing to a chair. Klaus sat, hands folded, trying to read the situation. This was expected. Interrogation, questions about units, movements, capabilities. He knew his duty, name, rank, serial number, nothing more. But the captain surprised him. The coffee this morning, he began, that caught you off guard. It wasn't a question. Klaus nodded slowly. You expected different treatment? Yes, Klaus admitted. We were told Americans didn't follow the conventions, that prisoners were... He stopped, uncertain how much to say. Shot, tortured, starved. The captain's expression didn't change. What else were you told? Klaus remained silent. The captain leaned back. I'm not interested in tactical information, Obergefreiter. Your unit is destroyed, and your commanding officers are either dead or captured. You have no intelligence value. But I am curious about something else. He pushed a propaganda leaflet across the table, one Klaus recognized, showing gruesome images supposedly depicting American treatment of prisoners. You believed this? Some of us did, Klaus said carefully. Some didn't. It was hard to know what was true. And now? Klaus thought about the coffee, the bread, the medic treating Werner's wound with the same care he'd given an American soldier. Now I don't know what to believe. The captain nodded as if expecting this answer. The truth is simpler than propaganda, Obergefreiter. We follow rules. You're fed what we're fed. You receive medical care. You're not beaten or tortured. In return, you follow camp regulations and don't try to escape. That's the arrangement. Why? The question escaped before Klaus could stop it. Why treat you decently? The captain considered. Because you're prisoners of war, not criminals. Because the Geneva Convention requires it. Because most of us believe there's a right way to fight, even in war. He paused. And because someday this war will end and we'll all have to live with what we did. The interrogation continued. Basic questions about Klaus's background, his family, his unit's recent movements. Nothing Klaus couldn't answer without violating his duty. The captain took notes, asked follow-up questions, but never pressed when Klaus remained silent. One more thing, the captain said as the session ended. You have family in Germany? Klaus hesitated, then nodded. A wife. 2 daughters, in Cologne. Cologne was bombed heavily. I know. The captain's expression softened slightly. Red Cross can help you send a message. Let them know you're alive. It takes time, but it works. Klaus stared. You would allow that? Geneva Convention, Article 70. Prisoners have the right to correspond with family. There's a form you can fill out. Limited words, censored obviously, but your wife will receive it eventually. Walking back to his tent, Klaus felt disoriented. Everything about this captivity contradicted what he'd expected. The coffee had been the first shock, but this, the possibility of telling Maria he was alive, that he hadn't died in the forest outside Aachen, was almost too much to process. That evening, the prisoners gathered around the stove as rain drummed on the canvas. Werner's head was healing properly, thanks to American medical supplies. Becker had received 2 blankets from a guard who'd noticed him shivering. Even Stern seemed less tense. My interrogation officer spoke about Geneva rules, Werner said. Said we'd be treated fairly as long as we followed regulations. Mine too, another soldier added. He seemed almost professional, not cruel. They're different than we were told, Becker said quietly. Everything's different. Stern poked at the stove. Don't confuse decent treatment with friendship. We're still prisoners. They're still the enemy. This is just how they run their camps. Better than our camps, someone muttered. The tent fell silent. Everyone knew what he meant. The rumors about camps in the East, about how Soviet prisoners were treated, about conditions that violated every convention. No one wanted to speak it aloud. Klaus lay on his pallet that night, thinking about the captain's offer, a message to Maria. Proof of life. He tried to imagine what words he could use, what message would fit within the strict limits, what he could say to make her understand he was safe, that he was coming home eventually, that somehow, impossibly, he'd survived. Outside, American guards changed shifts. Someone was playing harmonica, a melancholy tune that drifted through the camp. A German voice joined in, humming the same melody. Then another. Soon, half the camp was humming together, German prisoners and American guards, sharing a song neither side owned. Klaus closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, this strange moment of humanity in the middle of war. Chapter 4. Understanding through small gestures. Winter deepened, and the camp routine became familiar. Morning coffee, always hot, always real. Meals that, while simple, provided actual nutrition. Roll call work details, evening distribution of mail for those fortunate enough to receive it. Klaus had submitted his Red Cross form weeks ago, but responses took months, if they came at all. The Americans assigned prisoners to work details, clearing debris, repairing roads, helping in the camp kitchen. It was required by convention, and it broke up the monotony of captivity. Klaus found himself assigned to kitchen duty alongside Becker and a dozen others. The American mess sergeant was a thick-built man from Iowa named Kowalski, who ran his kitchen with military precision and surprising patience. Through gestures and broken German, he taught the prisoners how Americans wanted things done, how to peel potatoes efficiently, how to portion out servings fairly, how to maintain sanitation standards. One morning, as Klaus was scrubbing pots, Kowalski approached with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Klaus and leaned against the counter, sipping his own. You cook? Before war? Kowalski asked in his halting German. Teacher, Klaus replied. Mathematics. Secondary school. Kowalski nodded thoughtfully. My brother. Teacher too. History. Pennsylvania. They stood in companionable silence, drinking coffee while other prisoners and American soldiers moved about the kitchen. Klaus realized this was the longest conversation he'd had with an American beyond official interrogations. Coffee good? Kowalski asked. Very good, thank you. You surprised? First day. I see your face. Kowalski smiled slightly, all German surprised. We were told different things, Klaus admitted carefully. Propaganda, Kowalski said using the English word. Both sides. My brother's letters say same thing. Americans told Germans are animals, monsters. Germans told Americans are criminals. He shrugged. Most of us just soldiers, just men. The simplicity of this observation struck Klaus. Just men. Not ideologies or nations or causes, but individuals trying to survive an insane situation with whatever humanity they could preserve. Over the following weeks, small gestures accumulated. An American guard shared cigarettes with German prisoners during breaks. A medic stayed up late treating a prisoner's infected wound. Kowalski started teaching simple English words to the kitchen crew, laughing at their pronunciation but correcting them patiently. In February, Klaus received a Red Cross message. His hands trembled as he opened the thin paper. Maria's handwriting, cramped, limited to the prescribed words but unmistakably hers. Alive. Daughters safe. House damaged but standing. We pray for you daily. Love always. Klaus read it 17 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket. Around him, other prisoners who'd received messages were having similar moments. Private grief, relief, connection to a world beyond the wire. That evening, Klaus showed the letter to Stern. The old Feldwebel read it silently, then handed it back. Good news, Klaus. The best kind. Your family? Klaus asked. Stern shook his head. Wife died in '43, bombing. My son is somewhere on the Eastern Front. He paused. If he's still alive. They sat in silence, each man holding his own weight of war. The next morning, Kowalski noticed Klaus's improved mood. Good news? From my wife. Family is alive. Kowalski's face lit up. Good, very good. He disappeared into his office and returned with something wrapped in brown paper. For you. Inside was chocolate. 2 bars of Hershey's, the kind American soldiers carried. Klaus stared at them, unable to speak. For daughters, Kowalski said, when you go home, tell them from American soldier, we're not all bad. Klaus's throat tightened. I will, thank you. War won't last forever, Kowalski said quietly. Someday you go home. You teach mathematics again. You see your girls grow up. You tell them about this time, you tell them what you want. But you remember, even in bad times, some people try to be good. Yes? Yes, Klaus managed. Spring arrived with warming temperatures and news of Germany's collapsing fronts. The prisoners knew the end was coming. Everyone could feel it. Some were relieved. Others were terrified about what defeat would mean for their families, their country, their future. One April morning, after the usual coffee service, Sergeant Fisher gathered the prisoners for an announcement. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. The news landed with complicated emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for all that was lost. Fear about what came next. Uncertainty about when they'd see home again. Klaus stood with his coffee cup, processing the information. Around him, men wept, prayed, or stood in shocked silence. Young Becker looked lost, his war ending before he'd barely entered manhood. Werner sat heavily on a log, head in hands. Even Stern seemed diminished, as if purpose had drained away. That evening Kowalski found Klaus in the kitchen. You'll go home soon, the sergeant said. Processing takes time, but you'll go home. What's left of home? Klaus replied. More than you think. People rebuild. Life continues. Kowalski paused. You remember what I said? About telling your daughters? Klaus nodded. That even in bad times some people try to be good. That's right. Kowalski extended his hand. Go home, Klaus. Teach your students. Raise your girls. Build something better. Klaus shook his hand. American and German, enemy, and, not friend perhaps, but 2 men who'd found humanity in an inhuman time. Weeks later, Klaus stood in a repatriation line with Stern, Becker, Werner, and dozens of others. They wore clean clothes provided by Americans, carried small packs with personal items and Red Cross parcels. The chocolate bars were still in Klaus's pocket, carefully preserved. As they filed toward the trucks that would take them to displaced persons camps and eventually home, Klaus looked back at the compound. American soldiers were already preparing for the next group, the endless processing of a continent trying to put itself back together. "Think you'll remember this?" Becker asked. Klaus thought about that first morning. The shock of hot coffee, the kindness of small gestures, the recognition that enemies were still human beings. "Yes," he said. "I'll remember." The truck rumbled to life, carrying them toward whatever future awaited in a defeated Germany. But Klaus carried something else with him. Evidence that even in war's darkness there were points of light. Small acts of decency that cost nothing but meant everything. He would tell his daughters about this, not to excuse war or pretend it was anything but terrible, but to show them that humanity could survive even the worst circumstances. That a cup of hot coffee, offered by an enemy who chose to see a fellow human rather than just a prisoner, could matter more than all the propaganda in the world. The truck crossed into Germany, toward Cologne, and whatever remained of home. Klaus closed his eyes and remembered the taste of real coffee.